In episode 6, Dorothy gets the mail, and shockingly, there's a letter for Leanne. She tells her about the letter, leaves it on the table, but the Turners have to run out because Sean needs to catch a flight. He's going with the Philadelphia Eagles, go Birds, to cater an event on the road, and she has to drive him to the airport. So they take off, and after they do, Leanne goes and opens up her letter, but when she does, she has a look of horror on her face. And it's not really a letter, it's more of a postcard that says, "Found you." She puts the postcard aside and continues to go about her day, but there's a knock at the door. It's a man drenched because it's pouring out, and this guy doesn't have an umbrella. And when Leanne opens the door, she once again has a look of horror on her face. She recognizes this guy. She lets him in, and he asks if the Turners are home, but she says, no, work. And then she instructs him to take his shoes off, because Dorothy doesn't like shoes in the house, which is weird because she's wearing hers. But this guy's suit that he's wearing is pretty tattered up, and the shoes that he's wearing have holes all over it. He's not wearing socks. Looks like he just walked here from Wisconsin. And his feet are pretty gross. But his main concern is with Jericho. They go upstairs and he's holding Jericho in his arms, looking at the baby. Later that day, when Dorothy gets home, she sees Leanne's postcard and she's a little freaked out by it too. When she heads upstairs to go check on Jericho, she can tell that something's wrong with Leanne, who's holding Jericho on the bed, and that's when this guy pops out, introducing himself as Leanne's Uncle George. And the Turners had no idea that Leanne even had family. He tells Dorothy that he was in town and he just wanted to check on her. And Dorothy's a little freaked out, but she's trying to be cordial. George has brought a gift for Jericho, and it's a marionette of a chef that's supposed to be Sean. It's made from wood back in their hometown. And it's creepy as hell looking, but Dorothy, being polite, thanks him. She then invites him to stay for dinner. And since this guy looks like he could use a free meal, he accepts. So Dorothy starts whipping up some food, and as she's doing so, she's FaceTiming Sean to see how he's doing. But he notices that she's making a lot of food. And Dorothy lets him know it's because they have a guest, Leanne's uncle. And that doesn't sit right with Sean at all. He says, who the hell is in our house? But Dorothy says, well, it's okay. Leanne vouched for him. And he shoots that down right away, saying, well, then who the hell vouched for her? But Dorothy just rushes him off, finishes the meal, and when she puts it on the table, she gets ready just to eat it, but George grabs her wrist. It really scares Dorothy, but there wasn't any malicious intent. He did so to pray. Dorothy starts trying to make conversation, but neither George or Leanne are giving her much back. And that's when Dorothy notices that George is drying the chicken out, patting it with his napkin. Dorothy doesn't say anything, but she does ask him, what do you do? And he says, salvage. He then starts wringing the chicken out, and even going so far as to grab Leanne's napkin to do so. More extremely bizarre behavior from this guy. When Dorothy gives Leanne a compliment, George says that Leanne was the most beautiful baby, although you wouldn't know it by looking at her now. George tells Dorothy that there's been issues back home and Leanne is needed. But this takes Dorothy completely off guard, and she says that doesn't really fit in with our plans. And George shoots back, do you have a contract? To which Dorothy says we have a verbal one, and he reminds her, yeah, for 1 month, just so you could fire her if you didn't like her. Thankfully for everybody, this awkward conversation is broken up when Julian rings the doorbell and comes in. He was called by Sean to make sure everything's okay. And shortly after arriving, Jericho is heard crying on the baby monitor. But when Leanne goes up to attend to him, George snaps at her, saying, what hours do you work? And to try and not cause confrontation, Dorothy says, I'll go look after him. And that's when Julian sits down and says, you want to tell me who the hell you are? But George sticks to the script, saying, I'm like you, Julian. I'm an uncle. Julian goes upstairs to the nursery when George and Leanne are busy washing and drying the dishes. And Dorothy says, we have a big problem. But the problem has nothing to do with this creep that's in their house. It has to do with the fact that Leanne is being taken from them. That's what she thinks is the big deal. And Julian says, good, let him. But Dorothy's not about to let that happen. She heads downstairs to the kitchen, and George says, I think we should go now. Train leaves in the morning. We'll get a hotel somewhere near the train station. But Dorothy, trying to force a stay of execution, if you will, insists that George sleep the night there because it is still pouring outside. And after being peer pressured by Leanne to do the same, George reluctantly accepts. But when Julian found out that Dorothy invited this guy to stay the night, he can't believe at what his sister just did. Even though she reassures him, I know what I'm doing. He immediately goes outside and FaceTimes Sean to let him know that this creep is staying, and he promises Sean that he will also stay. He'll sleep on the couch, make sure nothing weird happens. Upstairs, however, Dorothy is setting up the couch for George. And George says, call me old-fashioned, but a child's place is with her family. And Dorothy says, I couldn't agree more, but Leanne is hardly a child. And then George shows Dorothy a picture of Dorothy when she was a little girl and her mother. And he asks her, "When did your mother die, Dottie?" And Dorothy admits that Dottie was the nickname that her mother used to call her. Although the bigger question is, how does George know any of this? And that's a question that Dorothy never asks. Later that night, though, she tries to make the hiring official by bringing Leanne a contract. She apologizes, saying they should have done it a long time ago. And she's including a pay bump, telling her how much they like having her there. And it's actually bringing Leanne to tears because she does want to stay. So Dorothy says, "We just have to convince your uncle that it's the wise move for you to stay. Both of us, together." So everybody goes to sleep, but Julian is awoken in the middle of the night when he hears a bang. And when he goes to check on George, George isn't there. He checks just about every room in the house. And when he can't find George, he goes to wake up Dorothy saying, "Hey, he's gone." So both of them together start checking a couple of the rooms. But then they hear Jericho crying and they rush to the nursery. And Jericho is on the floor. And that's when Julian notices that in the crib is George, sleeping, a grown man in a baby crib. This guy walked in, took Julian out, put him on the floor, and climbed in. And right away, Julian says, "That's it, I'm kicking this guy out." But Dorothy begs him not to because she's worried that if they kick George out, they're going to lose Leanne forever. And Julian could not care less about that because this is weird as hell. But Dorothy tells him that not everybody is as normal as them. Just let it go. And she takes Jericho into bed with her, but does ask Julian, "Can you stay in here and make sure that he doesn't move?" Although Julian falls asleep, and when he wakes up the next morning, George is already downstairs for breakfast. And Dorothy has gone into full convince George Leanne needs to stay mode. I mean, she is dressed up like a nun, even embracing the whole praying thing, which catches Julian off guard. And nothing is said about the fact that this guy slept the night in the baby crib. When he goes to leave, he notices that his old shoes are gone and they're replaced with new shoes, or slightly used shoes from Sean. Dorothy tells him that he hasn't worn them in years, and she felt like George could use a new pair. So George quickly slips on into him and says, "Thank him for me." But then he calls for Leanne to say her goodbyes. And it's obvious that Leanne doesn't want to go, and Dorothy tries to tell him that, but he cuts her off and saying, "I wasn't talking to you, woman." Dorothy then implores Leanne to tell George how she feels, and she does, saying, "I want to stay." And George goes up to her, very confrontational-like, and says to her, "What about the others, the ones that deserve your help? You want to abandon them for this, for her?" And she says, "Yeah." So George says, "Very well then, I'll come back with your Aunt May. You know that you can't say no to her." But right before he leaves, he looks at everybody and just says, "This is a godless house," which Dorothy really takes to heart. And when Sean gets home from his trip, Dorothy has just gotten off the phone with the church to baptize Jericho, and there's no talking her out of it. Sean heads upstairs to the nursery to check on Jericho, but he also notices that creepy marionette that is now hanging from the ceiling. Although upstairs, in Leanne's room, she's looking outside because George never left. He's across the street, staring her down. Thank you so much for watching this recap. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Like the video if you liked it. Hit thumbs down if you thought it sucked. If you don't see the next video up in the end screen, don't worry, it'll be up soon. And please be nice in the comments section. Nobody likes being told they suck, even if it's true. Oh, and sharing's caring.